Jacob knew it wasn't over yet. Even though he had taken down the McCall gang, there was still one more step to take. Frank McCall, the ruthless leader, was still out there, and Jacob wasn't going to let him slip away. After the fight in the barn, Jacob had made sure that the remaining members of the gang were either captured or dead, but Frank had managed to escape in the chaos. Jacob wasn't surprised. Frank had always been good at getting away when things got too heated. The town of Riverbend was quiet for the moment, but Jacob knew that silence could be dangerous. Everyone was on edge, waiting for something to happen. As the sun began to set, the shadows grew long, and Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that Frank was out there. Planning his next move, he saddled his horse and left the barn, determined to find Frank before he could cause any more harm. As he rode through the hills, Jacob's mind kept returning to the past, the dark memories of the man he used to be. There was a time when he would have reveled in the chaos, the violence, and the bloodshed, but that man was long gone. He had built a new life for himself in Riverbend, and he wasn't about to let anyone, not even Frank, destroy it. Jacob didn't know where Frank had gone after escaping the barn, but he had a feeling the leader of the gang would try to make a last stand. Frank was a man who never gave up easily. If he couldn't control Riverbend, he would make sure no one else did. Jacob had to stop him before that happened. As night fell, Jacob's thoughts turned to the town. He couldn't shake the feeling that Frank was headed back there, and he had to act fast. He didn't have the luxury of time. The people of Riverbend were counting on him even if they didn't know it. He pushed his horse faster, the moonlight illuminating the path ahead. The cold wind whipped at his face, but Jacob barely noticed. His focus was unwavering. He had made a promise to himself, to the memory of Thunder, to stop Frank and protect the town. No matter what it took. The ride took longer than expected, and by the time Jacob reached Riverbend, it was nearly dawn. The streets were still and quiet, but he could sense that something wasn't right. The town felt different, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jacob dismounted and tied his horse to a post, then moved cautiously through the dark streets. His eyes scanned the town, looking for any sign of Frank. It didn't take long to find it. There, at the far end of the main street, a small group of men stood in the shadows. They weren't McCall's gang, but Jacob recognized them. They were the town's troublemakers, thugs who had been looking for a way to make money off the chaos that Frank had stirred up. Jacob knew they were only waiting for the right moment to strike. He kept his distance, observing them quietly. It wasn't until they started moving toward the center of town that Jacob realized what they were planning. They weren't just going to cause trouble. They were going to help Frank bring Riverbend to its knees. Jacob's mind raced. He couldn't let them get away with it. He needed to find Frank, and he needed to do it fast. The group of men had just turned the corner, heading toward the saloon. Jacob followed them quietly, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The saloon was the last place he wanted to be seen, but it was the most likely place where Frank would be hiding. As he approached the saloon, Jacob took a deep breath and prepared himself for what was coming. He knew the confrontation with Frank was inevitable, but he wasn't sure how it would play out. Frank had always been a dangerous man, one who didn't play by the same rules as everyone else. But Jacob had changed. He was no longer the man who would back down in the face of violence. He had been forced to confront his past, and now he was determined to make sure Riverbend stayed safe. Jacob moved toward the back of the saloon, keeping to the shadows. He could hear voices from inside, muffled through the walls, but he couldn't make out what they were saying. He wasn't sure if Frank was inside, or if he was waiting outside for the perfect moment to strike. All Jacob knew was that he had to act quickly. The door to the saloon creaked open and Jacob froze. He couldn't see who had come out, but he could tell by the footsteps that it was someone who knew the streets of Riverbend well. Someone who wasn't afraid of the dark. Someone like Frank. Jacob's heart raced as he took a step forward. He couldn't hesitate now. He had come too far. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The saloon was dimly lit with only a few candles flickering on the tables. There were a few people inside, all sitting in the corners, drinking and talking quietly. But Jacob's eyes immediately went to the back of the room, where Frank was sitting at a table surrounded by a few of his remaining men. Frank looked up when Jacob entered, his cold eyes narrowing as he saw the rancher. "Well, well," Frank said, his voice low but filled with malice. "You've finally come for me, huh? I knew it was just a matter of time before you showed up. Jacob didn't respond right away. He took a step forward, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. "I'm not here for a fight, Frank," he said quietly. "I'm here to end this." Frank chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You think you can just walk in here and take me down, Jacob? You think you can end everything with a few words? You've been playing it safe for too long. You don't know what it's like to be a man like me." Jacob's eyes narrowed. "I know exactly what it's like, Frank. I've been there. I've done the things you've done. But I'm not that man anymore. And neither are you, if you still have any decency left inside you." Frank's grin faded, replaced by an icy glare. He stood up slowly, his hand drifting toward his gun. "You've got some nerve, Jacob. You come here thinking you can change things, thinking you can stop me. Well, I'm not going to let that happen. This town's mine, and I'll burn it to the ground if I have to." Jacob's grip on his revolver tightened. The tension in the room was thick, and for a moment time seemed to slow. Frank was no longer the man Jacob had once known. He had become something darker, something driven by power and revenge, and Jacob knew that if he didn't stop him now, Riverbend would never be the same. "I don't want to kill you, Frank," Jacob said, his voice steady. "But if you make me, I will." For a moment, neither man moved. Then, in a flash, Frank's hand was at his side, pulling for his gun. But Jacob was faster. With one quick motion, he drew his revolver and fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the saloon. Frank's gun fell from his hand as he staggered back, blood staining his shirt. He looked up at Jacob, his expression one of disbelief. "You don't have to do this, Frank," Jacob said softly, his voice filled with regret. "But you forced my hand." Frank collapsed to the ground, his body twitching as life slowly faded from him. The room was silent, save for the sound of Frank's labored breathing. Jacob stood over him, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him. It was over. Frank McCall was dead. Jacob stood there for a long moment, his revolver still raised, before he slowly lowered it. He didn't feel the rush of victory that he expected. Instead, there was only a heavy silence, and the realization that the man he had once been had finally been buried for good. The quiet rancher was the man who had won, but it wasn't without sacrifice. And it wasn't without a cost. Jacob turned and walked out of the saloon, his heart heavy. The people of Riverbend would be safe for now. But he knew that nothing would ever be the same. He had become what they feared most, but in the end he had saved them all. The following days passed by in a blur for Jacob. The events at the shack were still fresh in his mind, and the feeling of having taken control again, of standing up to the McCall gang, was both unsettling and oddly satisfying. But even though he had avenged Thunder's death, Jacob knew deep down that it wasn't over. The McCall gang was just a piece of a much larger puzzle, and there were still remnants of his past he hadn't faced yet. For now, though, he had done what needed to be done. The McCall gang had been taught a lesson, but Jacob also knew that if he didn't stay vigilant, they'd be back for him. Maybe in an even more dangerous form. After that night, the quiet town of Riverbend seemed to change. Whispers about Jacob spread like wildfire, as stories of his actions began to circulate. The peaceful rancher who had lived quietly on his land, avoiding conflict, had now become something else, something they didn't fully understand. People had always respected Jacob, but now there was a new feeling that lingered when he walked through town. Some looked at him with admiration, while others viewed him with fear, as though he was no longer just a man to be trusted. One evening, as Jacob rode back from town after picking up supplies, he noticed something odd. The air was heavier, the silence more oppressive. His horse, now a sturdy, reliable companion, sensed it too. It pricked its ears and snorted, its nostrils flaring as if it could smell something amiss. Jacob slowed his pace, his instincts kicking in. Something wasn't right. He didn't have to wait long to find out what it was. As he approached a bend in the trail near his ranch, a figure appeared on the ridge above him. The man was silhouetted against the setting sun, a tall shadow looming over the path. Jacob's hand instinctively moved to his side, where his gun was holstered. He wasn't sure who this stranger was, but he knew that anyone coming up to his land now was someone he needed to keep an eye on. The figure stepped forward, revealing a familiar face, though it took Jacob a moment to recognize him. It was one of the men from the McCall gang, the one who had fled the shack after everything had gone down. His face was dirty and his clothes were torn. He looked desperate, like a man who had been running for days. He stopped a few paces from Jacob, his eyes wide and filled with fear. "Please don't shoot," the man said, his voice trembling. I didn't want this. I didn't want to be a part of it." Jacob said nothing. His gun was still raised, and he was waiting. The man continued, taking a step closer, though he didn't get too close. "Frank McCall. He's gone crazy, Jacob. He's planning something. He said if anyone tried to stop him, he'd make sure they paid for it. He's planning something big, something that could ruin you all." Jacob narrowed his eyes, his grip on the gun tightening. This was exactly what he had feared. The McCall gang wasn't finished yet. They had only retreated for the moment, but they were regrouping, getting ready for something bigger. "What do you want from me?" Jacob asked, his voice low but steady. I don't know if I can stop him. But I can't live with what we did, not anymore. "I'm asking you for help," the man said, almost pleading. "I can't go back to them. I'm asking you, please just give me a chance to make things right." Jacob's hand remained on the gun, but something in the man's eyes made him hesitate. This wasn't the same man who had fought him in the shack. This was a man who was scared, broken, someone who was trying to escape a life he had never truly wanted. Jacob had been there once too, lost, caught up in a world of violence with no way out. He didn't trust the man completely, but he also knew that not everyone who had been part of the McCall gang was beyond saving. "You've got one chance," Jacob said, his voice as cold as the mountain air. "One chance to prove you're not lying. Tell me what's going on and then we'll talk." The man nodded eagerly, relief flooding his face. He began to explain. "Frank's gone off the rails. He's been talking about something big, something that could hurt everyone in Riverbend. I don't know the details, but I overheard him talking to some of the other men. He said that if he couldn't control this town, he would burn it to the ground. He doesn't care anymore. It's not just about revenge now. He's looking to make a statement. He's planning on attacking tomorrow night somewhere in town. He hasn't decided where yet, but it's going to be bad." Jacob felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He didn't have much time. If Frank McCall was planning something as dangerous as it sounded, the people of Riverbend would be caught in the crossfire. Jacob's thoughts raced, trying to piece together the few clues he had. "Where is he now?" Jacob asked, his voice sharp. The man hesitated before answering. "He's hiding out in the old barn on the east side of town. It's where they've been staying for the last few days. There's no one there but the gang. I don't know if you can stop him, but if you don't, Riverbend won't stand a chance." Jacob nodded, already turning his horse around. He didn't have much time to think. He had to move, and he had to move fast. If Frank McCall and his gang were really planning an attack on Riverbend, then Jacob was the only one who could stop them. The man called after him, but Jacob didn't turn back. He had heard enough. The ride to the barn was quick. The setting sun cast long shadows on the ground, and Jacob pushed his horse faster, knowing that every second counted. The barn on the east side of town was old and run down, a place Jacob had passed many times but never really paid much attention to. It looked like any other abandoned building, but he knew that inside, the McCall gang was waiting. When he arrived, he dismounted quickly and tied his horse to a nearby post. He moved quietly, keeping to the shadows as he approached the barn. There were no guards posted outside, which told Jacob one thing. They were either overconfident or they had grown complacent. Either way, it worked to his advantage. He knew that he had the element of surprise on his side. Jacob reached the barn door and slowly pushed it open. The hinges creaked loudly, and for a moment he froze, listening. He heard nothing but the sound of his own heartbeat. The barn was dark, but he could make out the shapes of men gathered around in the far corner, talking in low voices. He didn't wait any longer. Jacob stepped inside, his revolver drawn and aimed at the first figure he saw. The man barely had time to react before the gunshot rang out. He fell to the ground, a loud crash echoing in the silence. "Don't move," Jacob growled, his voice steady and commanding. The rest of the gang looked up in shock, but they were too slow. Jacob fired once more, and another man dropped to the floor. The rest of the gang scrambled to reach for their weapons, but it was too late. Jacob's movements were fast, practiced. He was no longer just the rancher who wanted peace. He was a man who had been pushed too far. As the last of the McCall gang members fell to the floor, Jacob stood over them, breathing heavily. The fight had been quick, but it was not over. Frank McCall was still out there, and Jacob knew he would not rest until Frank was dealt with. There was no going back now. This section shows Jacob's decision to take action based on the information he received, confronting the McCall gang and discovering their plans. The tension is high as Jacob prepares for a showdown that will determine the fate of the town and his future. The door creaked loudly as Jacob pushed it open, stepping into the dimly lit shack. Inside, the McCall gang was gathered around a rickety wooden table, playing cards and laughing in low, gruff voices. The smell of smoke and cheap whiskey hung in the air, mixing with the musty scent of old wood and dust. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his face calm, his hand steady on the revolver that hung at his side. The men at the table didn't notice him at first, too caught up in their game. Jacob's boots made no sound on the floor as he moved closer. The shack wasn't much, a small one-room building with broken windows and walls that had seen better days. A few candles flickered on the table, casting shadows on the faces of the men. There were 5 of them in total, including the leader, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek named Frank McCall. He was the one who had sent the message when they killed Thunder. Jacob's fingers tightened around the revolver. He could feel the weight of what he was about to do. The man he had been, the quiet rancher who only wanted peace, seemed like someone far away now. In his place stood the man who had once been a part of a world he had abandoned, a world of danger and violence. It had been years since he'd picked up a gun with the intent to kill, but he knew that if he didn't act now, the McCall gang would make sure he never had a chance to stop them. One of the men, a younger fellow with a patch over one eye, was the first to spot him. He narrowed his good eye, squinting at Jacob in confusion. "Who the hell are you?" he growled, reaching for the gun at his waist. Jacob didn't say a word. His hand moved faster than anyone could blink. In a single fluid motion, he pulled out his revolver and aimed it at the man. The young thug froze, his hand halfway to his holster. The other men looked up in surprise, their laughter dying on their lips as they saw the gun pointed at their friend. "Don't move," Jacob said, his voice cold and steady. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything he had been through. The years of anger, grief, and regret. Everything had led to this moment. Frank McCall, the leader, slowly stood up from his seat, his chair scraping against the floor. He was a tall man with a thick beard and hard eyes. "Well, well," he said, a grin spreading across his face. "Look what we have here." The quiet rancher finally decided to come and say hello. "What's the matter, Jacob? Did you miss us?" Jacob didn't respond to the taunt. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on Frank, cold and unwavering. "I'm not here to talk," he said flatly. "I'm here for revenge." The room fell silent. The men exchanged uneasy glances. They had heard the rumors about Jacob, the man who had once been part of a much darker world. The man who had left that life behind, or so they thought. Now they realized that they had made a dangerous mistake. They had killed Thunder, and in doing so they had awakened a side of Jacob that none of them had expected. Frank laughed, but it was a nervous sound, not the confident, mocking laugh Jacob had expected. "Revenge, huh?" Frank said, stepping forward, his hand slowly rising in a mock show of peace. "You really think you're in a position to take revenge on us, Jacob? You've got a gun, sure, but there's 5 of us and 1 of you. You're outnumbered." Jacob's eyes never left Frank's. "It's not about numbers," he replied, his voice low. "It's about who wants it more." Frank sneered and gestured to his men. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But you're still just a farmer who got lucky. We don't play by the same rules as you." The young man who had reached for his gun earlier took a step forward, his hand now resting on the handle of his revolver. "Maybe we should teach him a lesson," he said, trying to sound tough, though his voice wavered slightly. Before he could make a move, Jacob's revolver fired with a loud crack. The bullet struck the floor near the young man's feet, sending a spray of dust into the air. The man jumped back in shock, his face pale. Jacob didn't flinch. He simply looked at him, the gun still raised, waiting. Frank's grin faded, replaced by a look of anger. "You've got guts, all right," he said through clenched teeth. "But you're still making a big mistake." "I've made my choice," Jacob replied, his voice calm but filled with resolve. "And I'm not backing down." For a moment, the room was still. The only sound was the faint crackling of the candles on the table. The McCall gang seemed unsure of what to do next. They had underestimated Jacob, thought he was just a man who would roll over in the face of violence. But Jacob had changed. He wasn't the same rancher who had come to Riverbend looking for peace. He was a man driven by a deep, burning anger, a man with nothing left to lose. Finally, Frank seemed to snap out of his stupor. He nodded to his men, who slowly started to reach for their guns. Jacob could see the tension in their movements, the uncertainty, the hesitation. They were used to intimidating others, not the other way around. They had expected Jacob to be an easy target, someone they could scare into submission. Instead, they had found themselves facing a man who wasn't afraid to die, a man who was willing to risk everything for revenge. With a swift motion, Frank pulled his own revolver from his belt. But Jacob was faster. Before Frank could raise his gun, Jacob fired. The shot struck Frank's hand, knocking the weapon from his grip. Frank cried out in pain, his face twisting in surprise and anger. The rest of the gang hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Jacob didn't wait for them to make up their minds. He moved quickly, taking control of the situation with a cold, methodical precision. He had trained for this in the past. He knew how to handle men like these, how to make sure they didn't get the chance to hurt him. The young man who had first spoken to Jacob tried to make a move, but Jacob's revolver was already aimed at him. The shot rang out again, this time hitting the man in the shoulder. He screamed in pain, falling to the floor, clutching his wound. Jacob moved swiftly, his eyes scanning the room. 2 more men tried to reach for their guns at the same time. They weren't quick enough. 2 more shots rang out and both men dropped to the floor, one clutching his chest, the other falling back with a bullet in his leg. The last man, the oldest of the group, looked around in panic. His eyes widened as he saw his gangmates lying on the ground, either dead or wounded. He was the only one left standing, and he knew that he was no match for Jacob. He took a step back, his hands raised in surrender. Jacob kept his gun trained on him, but he didn't pull the trigger. The man was no threat now. He was broken, defeated. Jacob didn't need to kill him. "Get out of here," Jacob said coldly, "and don't come back." The man didn't hesitate. He turned and ran, stumbling over his own feet as he hurried out of the shack. Jacob watched him go, his breath coming in steady, controlled bursts. He felt no satisfaction from the violence he had just caused, but there was a sense of closure. Thunder's death had been avenged. The McCall gang had paid for what they had done. Jacob stood alone in the shack, surrounded by the chaos he had created. His heart still ached from the loss of Thunder, but he knew that this was only the beginning. There was no going back. The man who had walked into that shack was not the same man who had left it. The quiet rancher was gone, replaced by a man who had been forced to confront his past and had survived it. And now there was no turning back. Jacob stood in the field, staring down at Thunder's lifeless body. The cold wind blew across the valley, carrying with it the scent of the mountain pines and the earth. But all Jacob could smell now was the sharp, metallic scent of blood. His heart ached as he stood there, frozen in disbelief. He had lost his closest companion, the one creature who had been with him through everything. And worse, he knew who was responsible: the McCall gang. They had done this to send a message, to remind Jacob of the violent past he had once left behind. But they had made a fatal mistake. They didn't understand what they had done. They had underestimated him. Jacob had once been a part of that world, the world of outlaws, violence, and chaos. It was a life he had turned his back on, hoping for peace and quiet, but the McCall gang had pulled him back into it with their cruelty. Jacob gently patted Thunder's bloodied neck, his hands trembling with a mix of grief and anger. He could feel the weight of the horse's death pressing on his chest, but there was something else too, a fire that had been reignited deep within him. He had spent years trying to bury the man he had once been, but the McCall gang had ripped that mask off. Now, all that was left was the need for vengeance. He turned away from Thunder's body and began walking back to his cabin. His mind was racing. He had to act fast. He couldn't let the McCall gang think they had won. They needed to understand that there was still one person in the world who could stand up to them, even if it meant embracing the darkness he had left behind. That night, Jacob couldn't sleep. His thoughts kept returning to the same thing: revenge. He had never been a violent man, but the loss of Thunder was a wound that couldn't be healed. And it wasn't just about the horse, it was about everything the McCall gang represented. They were a reminder of the life he had escaped, a life filled with bloodshed, crime, and betrayal. They were a threat to everything he had built, everything he had fought for. Jacob's mind kept turning over the old skills he had learned in his past life. He had once been known as one of the fastest guns in the West, a man who had survived by his wits and his ability to handle a weapon. But that man, the outlaw, was a memory now. He had hung up his guns long ago and tried to live a peaceful life. The McCall gang had shattered that peace, and with it, They had awakened something in Jacob that had been lying dormant for years. He knew he couldn't go to the law. Riverbend was a small town, and the lawmen there were no match for the McCall gang. They were just as afraid of the gang as everyone else. No, if Jacob was going to get justice for Thunder, he was going to have to do it himself. There was no other way. The next morning, Jacob saddled up a new horse, one he had kept in the barn for just such an occasion, and set off toward the nearest town. He knew the McCall gang had a hideout there, a run-down shack on the outskirts of a small mining village. He had heard whispers of it before, but he had never paid much attention. He had hoped he would never need to. Now, though, it was the only lead he had. The ride to the village took most of the day, and Jacob didn't speak to anyone along the way. His thoughts were too clouded with anger and grief to make small talk with anyone. When he finally reached the village, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dusty streets. He didn't waste any time. He headed straight for the saloon, the one place where people gathered to talk. There, he hoped to find someone who could give him information on where the McCall gang was hiding. Inside the saloon, a few men sat at the bar, nursing their drinks. A piano played softly in the corner, and the low murmur of conversation filled the room. Jacob stepped inside, and the room went quiet for a moment. People had heard of him, the quiet rancher who lived up in the hills, and now they saw him standing in the doorway, a determined look on his face. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He walked up to the bartender, a man named Roy, who was polishing a glass. "I'm looking for the McCall gang," Jacob said, his voice low but firm. Roy looked at him for a moment, his eyes darting nervously to the others in the room. "You sure about that, Jacob?" he asked. "The McCall gang isn't something you want to tangle with. Those boys are dangerous." Jacob didn't flinch. "I don't have a choice. They killed my horse. I'm going to make them pay for it." Roy sighed and wiped his hands on his apron. He seemed to be thinking, weighing the risk of helping Jacob. Finally, he spoke in a hushed voice. "I heard they've been holed up just outside town in an old shack by the cliffs. But be careful. Those men don't take kindly to strangers, and they sure as hell won't let you walk away once they see you." Jacob nodded. "I'll take my chances." He didn't wait for more advice. He turned and walked out of the saloon, his boots tapping against the wooden floor. Outside, the night had fallen and the air was crisp. He mounted his horse and rode out of the village, heading toward the cliffs. As Jacob rode through the darkened landscape, the weight of what he was about to do began to settle in. This wasn't just about revenge for Thunder anymore. This was about taking back his life, about confronting the past he had tried so hard to outrun. The McCall gang had ruined that. They had brought him back to a world he had hoped to escape forever. By the time Jacob reached the shack, the moon was high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. He tied his horse to a tree and approached the building cautiously. The shack was old and weather-beaten, barely standing against the elements. But there was a light flickering inside, and Jacob knew that the McCall gang was there. He crept closer, his hand resting on the handle of the revolver at his side. He had kept the gun for years, never intending to use it again. But now it felt like a necessary tool, a means to an end. As he reached the door, he paused, listening. He could hear voices inside, rough and low. The gang was talking, laughing, unaware of the danger that was about to find them. Jacob took a deep breath, then pushed the door open. Jacob Harrison was a man of few words, and even fewer people knew him well. He lived on a small ranch nestled in the foothills of a vast mountain range. The land was rough, covered in thick forests and steep cliffs, making it difficult to grow anything. But Jacob didn't mind. His ranch was modest, but it was his, and he cared for it as if it were the most precious thing in the world. The daily grind of ranching, feeding livestock, and maintaining fences kept him busy, but that was how he liked it. Every day, Jacob woke up early, just before the sun rose. He started the day by saddling his horse Thunder and riding out to check on the cattle. Thunder, a sturdy and loyal horse, was more than just an animal to Jacob. He was family. Over the years, they had developed a bond that no one could truly understand unless they saw it themselves. Thunder had been with Jacob through thick and thin, and the two of them had become inseparable. They communicated without words, their movements and actions in perfect harmony, a dance that only the closest of companions could pull off. The town of Riverbend, which was about 10 miles from Jacob's ranch, was small. Most of the people there were either farmers, ranchers, or traders who made their living off the land. Jacob wasn't much of a socializer, so he kept to himself. He would occasionally visit the town for supplies, but most of his time was spent on his ranch. People in Riverbend had heard the stories about Jacob's past, how he had once been part of a much larger world, a world filled with danger, violence, and crime. But that was a long time ago, and Jacob had put all that behind him. Now, he was just a simple rancher who wanted nothing more than peace and quiet. Despite his quiet nature, Jacob was respected in the town. He had a reputation for being dependable, hardworking, and honest. People knew that if they needed help with something, whether it was repairing a fence or fixing a broken plow, Jacob was the man to call. He wasn't the type to seek attention or praise, but when it was needed, he was there. But not everyone saw Jacob in this light. Some of the younger men in the town who didn't know him personally whispered stories about his past. They talked about the time before he had settled in Riverbend, about the violence that had followed him wherever he went. But these were just stories, rumors passed down from people who didn't understand. The truth was that Jacob had done everything in his power to leave that past behind. He had hoped to build a new life for himself, one where he wasn't defined by the things he had done in the past. The only family Jacob had left was his older brother, who had long since moved away. His parents had passed away years ago, and since then Jacob had lived alone. He wasn't lonely, though. His animals were enough company for him. He'd always preferred the peace of the ranch to the noise of a crowded town. Thunder was his closest friend, and Jacob often talked to him as though the horse could understand. They had their routines, and Jacob was content. Every evening after finishing his work on the ranch, Jacob would take a quiet ride through the hills, just him and Thunder. The landscape was beautiful, with wide open fields stretching as far as the eye could see. The wind would whisper through the tall grass, and the setting sun would paint the sky with brilliant hues of orange, pink, and purple. It was during these rides that Jacob felt truly at peace. There was no noise, no rush, just the steady rhythm of Thunder's hooves and the sound of nature all around them. It was in these moments that Jacob felt most himself, free and unburdened. One such evening, after a long day of herding cattle, Jacob and Thunder took their usual route along the ridge that overlooked the valley. It had been a particularly hard day, with a few of the cows getting loose and causing trouble, but Jacob didn't mind. Hard work was something he was used to. They made their way slowly down the familiar path, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows on the ground. Suddenly, as they rounded a bend, Jacob noticed something strange. At first, it was just a flicker in the distance, a shadow maybe, moving swiftly through the trees. But as he drew closer, the shape became clearer and his heart sank. Thunder, sensing his unease, stopped in his tracks and snorted nervously. There in the field ahead of them was a figure lying motionless on the ground. At first, Jacob couldn't believe his eyes. It couldn't be. But as he urged Thunder forward, he saw that it was true. His horse, Thunder, had been shot and left to die. The blood had already begun to soak into the ground, and the horse's once glorious mane was matted with dirt and blood. Jacob dismounted in a daze, his hands trembling as he knelt beside the animal. It was clear that Thunder had been killed on purpose. This wasn't the work of a predator or a wild animal. The damage was too deliberate. Thunder had been shot, and it wasn't just a random act of violence, it was personal. Jacob's mind raced. He knew exactly who was behind this, the McCall gang, the very same group of men that Jacob had once crossed paths with in his past, the same gang that had caused trouble all over the region. Jacob had hoped he'd seen the last of them, but now it was clear. They had returned. They were sending him a message, a cruel, violent message that left no room for doubt. They wanted him to feel the pain of losing something dear, something he could never replace. Thunder had been more than just a horse to Jacob. He had been his companion, his friend, the one who had stood by him through every hard day. And now that bond was broken. Jacob felt a surge of anger deep inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. It was a feeling that he had tried to bury, a feeling that was now rising to the surface. The McCall gang had made a grave mistake. They had thought that killing Thunder would break Jacob, that it would force him to bow to their power. But instead, they had awoken something in him that he had long since buried. Jacob was no longer the quiet rancher who could be left alone. The violence of his past had returned, and it was not something the McCall gang would be able to escape. Jacob stood up slowly, his mind made up. He couldn't let this go. Not this time. His grief was overwhelming, but so was his anger. The time for peace was over. The McCall gang had made a terrible mistake, and Jacob knew that they would pay for it. The rancher who had once lived a quiet life tending to his animals and keeping to himself was gone. In his place was a man on a mission, a man seeking revenge. As Jacob looked down at Thunder, he whispered a quiet promise. "I'll make them pay, old friend. I'll make them pay for this." And so began the journey of a man who had once left violence behind, only to be forced back into a world he had tried so hard to forget.